Thanks for that introduction. My name's Mark Dowd, and I'm going to be speaking about memory corruption mitigations in modern operating systems, and particularly how they've impacted the cost of attackers wishing to exploit these flaws, and compare that to how it used to be about 10 years ago to how it is now. A brief introduction of my career. So I've been doing vulnerability research for a while, so this is an area that particularly interests me. For a long time I was doing vulnerability research and exploit dev for ISS, which is now IBM. Following that I started my own company, Azimuth Security, and we've actually consulted to various vendors about some of these current mitigations and trying to break them. So I'm pretty familiar with some of them. And in addition, I've done a bit of security research of my own and presented at various conferences on that. I basically wanted to talk about memory corruption mitigations and where they're going because memory corruption continues to be a big deal, like it always has been, and it's going to be for the foreseeable future, really. There's thousands of bugs in total. CVE thinks 1,000 bugs every year or so, and it's not just the volume of memory corruption bugs, but also the highest impact ones that you hear about are basically mostly memory corruption ones. So heartbleed, stage fright, basically everything you see at Pwn2Own, various jailbreak things and so on. So I've got 30 minutes and this is basically what I want to cover. Essentially the overall strategy that modern operating systems and vendors have used to approach security. Basically, what have we got? And then I want to talk about the offensive side of it and what they used to have to do versus what they have to do now so that we can sort of compare and contrast and work out what cost has been added to them as a result of the efforts by these vendors. And then I will try and talk about some future predictions of mine. And by the way, this talk is about state-of-the-art mitigations. Most mature operating systems such as Windows and iOS and that use very state-of-the-art, mitigation technology, but a lot of IoT devices don't, and as such are pretty wide open and probably will be for the foreseeable future. So I'm not going to be considering IoT stuff. Okay, so for defense, vendors have basically adopted a three-tier approach. First of all, they've done bug minimization, which is their attempts to basically create bug-free software or as close as they can to it. Then exploit mitigations, and then isolation, which is sandboxing. And I'll talk about all three of these things separately. Their goals have basically been in response to early work on exploitation, where they noticed that it was very easy to exploit bugs to compromise their systems. So they basically wanted to reduce the window of attack, render some or all of these bugs unexploitable, and for ones that they were unable to render unexploitable, at least raise the cost of development so that you had to put in a lot of effort to try and successfully exploit them. Of course, also compromise exploit reliability so that even if you did exploit them, a lot of the times these attempts would fail. So bug minimization is the first stage of this. And this is, like I said, an attempt to produce bug-free code. There's been a whole lot of technology that has gone into trying to make this happen with varying success. A lot of vendors do various different things. The first thing is attack surface reduction. So sort of looking at their software going, what can attackers target and interact with? How can we make that attack surface smaller? Vendors now are constantly looking for ways to maybe trim some of the fat, especially with older legacy technologies, to make them less available so that attackers can't attack them. One example I can think of is when Microsoft introduced Edge, they got rid of a whole lot of legacy technologies. You can't interact with WMF and EMF files anymore. You can't use VBScript and VML and things like that. Also, Google recently changed their browser, I believe, to use click-to-play Flash because Flash was such a problem. So that's the kind of thing that we're talking about there. In addition, we have static analysis tools, which used to be quite rudimentary, but have become increasingly sophisticated. And particularly the static analysis stuff that's gone into compilers and IDEs to perhaps inform developers and help them create code that's not going to have these kind of vulnerabilities in them. And of course, the thing you will have heard about probably the most is, you know, the fuzzing and bug bounties side of things, where vendors acknowledge, okay, we're still going to have some bugs. Let's put our software through some pretty epic testing compared to what they used to do, and try and get rid of these bugs before they become a problem. I know that Google uses cluster fuzz. They used to run like 10 million tests of Chrome per day, and that was back in like 2012 or something. So whatever they do now must be like way further than that. Other vendors do similar, Microsoft with their Sage technology, and I presume Apple does quite a lot of fuzzing, but since they're quite not very open about their practices, we don't know exactly. So after that, we've gone, okay, well, let's make the assumption that some bugs made it through code into production. So vendors then started to look at exploit mitigations and say, okay, we assume that bugs are in code. How can we make exploitation of these bugs not possible or not practical? The goal with most mitigations is to either render a whole class of bugs unexploitable, raise the cost of development for bugs that still are exploitable, and compromise reliability, like the goals we talked about before. I don't have enough time to go through all these mitigations, but they're all things that you would have heard of before. ASLR and DEP were really the first big ones that came along, and also heap hardening to prevent standard heap overflow strategies. And then more recently, you know, vendors are trying to combat things like ROP, and that's where we get like CFG, control flow guard, control flow integrity, and GRSEX wrap things to try and protect against that. And we also have code signing, which has been largely an Apple thing, but other vendors are increasingly looking to adopt this kind of technology. In terms of mitigations, there's both early and late stage mitigations. Early stage mitigations are those that basically attempt to completely obliterate an entire bug class, and they do so by trying to stop you from doing control flow hijacking or something like that. They'll attempt to detect if data structures have been modified, or maybe they'll just encode the data structures so that you don't know how to modify them to do something useful. These mitigations generally apply to only 1 or 2 bug classes each, but they're exceedingly effective in those particular instances. The problem we have, of course, is that when new bug classes get discovered, the old mitigations become somewhat useless against those. Then we have late-stage mitigations where the vendors have said, okay, let's assume that data structures have been corrupted and the attacker has been able to gain control of the process and try to, change execution flow to something of their choosing. So the late-stage mitigations then attempt to prevent arbitrary code from loading or executing. These are really useful because they can hinder most attacks, since most attacks have the goal of executing arbitrary code. And these are the things like ASLR and NX, and then more recently CFG, JIT hardening, and code signing. Now, these mitigations have various usefulness, and I've tried to categorize them here. The most important thing to note is whether they render bugs unexploitable, and also the cost that they incur to develop an exploit to work around it. Now, a lot of mitigations will produce a one-time cost, where you will have to figure out a way to bypass the mitigation, but once you do, you can reuse that technique over and over again. So that's very good for the attacker. Other mitigations produce a recurring cost, where you have to work out a way to bypass the mitigation in each instance that you use it. I've been fairly generous with what I've labeled as recurring or not, because you can consider recurring in 2 different ways. One way is if you have to rework the solution in different contexts, and the other one is reworking the solution in the same context. So, for example, if you're exploiting the same browser over and over again, can you use the same CFG bypass, for example, for multiple exploits? And generally, the answer for that is yes. Late-stage mitigations generally don't compromise reliability very much, but what they do is create a very high cost for gaining code execution. Once you've got NX and particularly some of the other things added to it, like CFG or code signing, suddenly getting unconstrained code running is very difficult. The last thing we have is isolation. This is basically where you go, okay, we've shipped some software that probably has bugs in it, and those bugs can be successfully exploited. So what we want to do here is create an environment where the process that has been compromised cannot adversely affect the other system, the rest of the system, to install malware, to install CNCs, or read sensitive data, or whatever. There's been a number of technologies that have come across over the last few years and been iteratively improved on. But most of those technologies get implemented into sandboxes. So that's basically an overview of what mitigations and technologies vendors are working on at the moment. And I wanted to look at, from an attacker's perspective, how you go about getting around these and what cost has been produced for you. So firstly, you have to consider what you're trying to do. So for most exploits, basically they want to do arbitrary code execution. They will leverage some sort of memory access vulnerability, whether it's a buffer overflow, use after free, type confusion, or whatever, and then basically try and execute their own code from that. Now, each exploit is unique, but they generally follow a pretty standard template. Usually there's early stage exploitation, which is trigger the bug. Late stage exploitation, which is where you want to introduce new code to execute, and then post exploitation, which is run that new code and do whatever else you want to do. This used to be very straightforward when the standards was like stack overflows. Basically, you would just overflow the stack, change an instruction pointer, you could point it back at the stack to your own data, and because there was no NX or anything, you could just run your own code. These days, though, it's a lot more complicated. The cost for developing these exploits has increased quite dramatically when all these mitigations are in place and when they've been matured a certain amount. Bypassing them is often non-trivial, and another very important thing to note is that vendors have got more aggressive about patching now. So you're taking longer to write an exploit, and it's useful for less amount of time due to patching. I would say that sandboxes have probably had the biggest effect on development time by quite a long way, because if you want to compromise a system, we used to talk about writing an exploit to compromise that system, but now we talk about exploit chains, where you have to compromise the process, then do a sandbox escape of some kind. So basically, there's if you're considering a calculation for an attacker, they have to consider the amount of time to discover the vulnerabilities and the amount of time to develop the exploit. Like I said, you often need to find multiple bugs now, and then once you've done that, you can develop them, put them together, and create an exploit chain. Discovery time is very difficult to quantify because it's non-linear. Sometimes you can find something in a day, sometimes it can take 3 months. I looked at a lot of presentations when researching this one about fuzzing and the various statistics that they had for this, and it was basically all over the map depending on what they were fuzzing, how sophisticated their setup was, and how long it took. So this is a very difficult thing to estimate, and also it depends a lot on what software you're attacking. The other thing you have to consider now, a lot more than in the past, is whether the bugs you discover are actually usable. So in the past, when you found memory corruption bugs, basically all of them were usable. There was no real hindrance. But now mitigations might make quite a lot of these unusable. So only every fourth or fifth bug might be usable now, as opposed to every second bug in the past. I did find this interesting statistic from a CanSec West presentation by Dan Kaminsky and Adam Cicchetti in 2011. They actually fuzzed the same software using the same fuzzing test harness at different iterations of that software that was released in different years. And then they plotted the amount of exploitable bugs they found in that software. So you see that as time has progressed, that some of the bug minimization strategies have in fact been somewhat successful in getting rid of some of the more exploitable bugs in this software. Obviously, all software doesn't have a uniform downward trajectory like this because they keep introducing new features. But those new features often have are often a little bit less at risk than legacy code because they've been built with these IDEs that have static analysis tools, and developer education is a lot better. So this is my estimate of discovery cost of finding vulnerabilities in the early 2000s versus now. The main thing I would say about this is that you'll notice that we've gone from basically about a week to find a vulnerability before, in many cases, to now like 3 or 4 weeks, possibly. And if you're looking for major vulnerabilities in like IIS or something like that, they're basically moonshots in a lot of cases. Also, in the past, kernel bugs were not necessarily required to do a reasonable compromise. So, in addition to the discovery cost, there's the development cost. I ran across this, which was a recent paper released by Lillian Ablin and Andy Bogart for the RAND Corporation, and they basically talked about, essentially they said, developing an exploit once you've found it takes about 22 days. I don't think this is too far off the mark, but their data collection is quite dubious because they collected a whole bunch of 0-day and measured the amount of time to develop them, but that 0-day spanned from 2000 to 2015. So they're basically making the assumption that everything is uniform and nothing has got harder over time, which of course it has. So in order to illustrate what the cost is, I figured we could do a walkthrough and see how basically browser hacking works, since that's the most popular form of memory corruption. What I'll do is I'll present different bugs and incrementally introduce mitigations and show you how those mitigations create problems and what you have to do basically in an exploit. This is only considering development time, so we're assuming that you've already discovered the bugs and this is the development time for them. So we're going to start off with a use after free in a web browser from about 2008. Back then, writing an exploit basically consisted of these 3 stages. You would trigger a vulnerability, corrupt memory or trigger the use after free. You would cease program execution. This would depend on exactly what kind of bug it is to how you do this, and then run your post-exploitation payload. So this is the Aurora bug that affected IE 6 and 7, and it was written about 2008, and Dino Dezovi actually did a really good presentation where he dissected the vulnerability and talked about the exploit that was found in the wild. But essentially, you can see the stages there of what they had to do. They trigger the bug by freeing an object. They basically do a heap spray to replace that object in memory with something that they can control that points back to their own data, which has shellcode placed at the end of it. And then they access the free object, which causes a vtable pointer dereference and executes their own code. So this is pretty straightforward, and it wouldn't have taken very long to develop. I'm guessing about 3 to 7 days. So let's move forward to IE 11 and Windows 8. This is about 2015. A lot of mitigations have gone in place since IE 7. They added a more mature ASLR, DEP. Now there's control flow guard, stronger heap mitigations, and we will ignore the sandbox for now. So now this is more what a modern exploit would look like in terms of the stages of development. You can't just go from triggering the bug to getting code execution. Now there's an extra stage where you have to bypass ASLR, and essentially that means information leaking. Information leaking you can usually do by either repurposing the memory corruption vulnerability you found, or it's possible you'll have to find a separate memory info leaking bug in order to find the information you need to bypass ASLR. And remember what we said about development time, where finding additional bugs is potentially quite a large overhead. The other thing you'll notice is that code execution isn't the two things anymore. It isn't one stage anymore, it's two stages. Because of NX, you can't just execute your own code. You have to basically change the memory protections of where your data is so that it's executable and then run it. Not only that, but once CFG is in place, you have the problem that you can't just do unconstrained ROP. And both of those can be quite a large burden to the exploit developer, particularly ROP payload development. And then you can run your post-exploitation payload. So this was a vulnerability that Core Security exploited for one of the pwn2owns, I think in 2015. And you can basically see that they took a number of extra steps in order to gain code execution. The things to note here is stage 2, they actually used an entirely separate information leaking bug, which is a pretty significant change. And step 4, they had to bypass CFG and also do ROP. At this point in time, CFG was actually very immature, so they didn't really have to do very much. But if you were exploiting a bug today, this would be a significantly more involved process. I think this would take about 2 or 3 weeks. So then, the thing is they were exploiting IE11. IE11 has a sandbox, so now let's turn that sandbox on. And again, we have to add another stage to exploit development. In the past, we didn't have this stage. Once you had code execution, you could basically steal all the user's data and that kind of thing. Now that's not so easy. You essentially have to find a second vulnerability in either the broker for the sandbox, or in the kernel, or some system service that the sandbox permits you to be able to communicate with. And then once you find that vulnerability, you have to exploit that vulnerability and basically do stages 1 to 4, but for the other process that you're trying to exploit. So this is the same bug. They did the same things here, but then they have to essentially do all this over again to get kernel code execution. I borrowed someone else's kernel exploit to put in here, but basically, yeah, they had to do information leaking, memory grooming, and then eventually, get system. So this is a massive cost to the development process, which before I said took 2 to 3 weeks. Now this will take 5 to 6 because I have to do twice as much work. And incidentally, have to have expertise in 2 different areas of technology. So you might think that mitigations have added to the development time, but apart from that, why didn't they protect us from this kind of attack? But a lot of people talk about that when you see Black Hat talks about browser mitigation bypasses and that kind of thing. But really, browsers are the weakest measure of mitigation success. Admittedly, one of the most prevalent because it is the most attacked thing, and there's good reason for that. The attacker has favorable conditions. They've got a large attack surface to find bugs in. But more importantly, they're able to groom memory and interact with the JavaScript engine and get programmatic feedback, which is critical for information leaking. And beyond that, all browsers have just-in-time, like JIT regions of memory that are marked executable to speed up JavaScript execution. And abusing various JIT features has been a strategy for a very long time for attackers to basically bypass both CFG and NX. If you consider other use cases such as server software, you'll see that the mitigations have been dramatically more effective, because the attacker is basically vastly more constrained in what they're able to do. So I looked up, Microsoft Service software as an example of this, and there used to be like tons of exploits coming out for Microsoft Service software all the time. RPC, MS SQL. a bunch of them got made into worms, as you probably remember. And I also wrote some myself in my previous job. Once ASLR and DEP became mature in Windows, I couldn't find a single example of getting complete code execution of a Microsoft server product. Not to say they don't exist if private organizations are able to find them and exploit them, but basically the cost, the mitigation effectiveness in this situation is dramatically better. Another example is, of course, MMS. So, stage fright was a big thing not long ago, and there was like 30 or 40 remote CVEs, and they're all reachable from MMS, but did you see a stage fright worm? No. And the answer is because of ASLR and NX dramatically compromised the ability to create exploits for this. Even Project Zero, who successfully exploited one of the stage fright bugs, chose to do so via the browser because it's a drastically easier place from where to attack. Lastly, there's a data point, case in point is Project Zero offered a prize for this recently. It said $200,000 for anyone who can produce a fully remote, non-interactive Android pixel chain. And, stage fright would qualify for this. You find a vulnerability in that. The media service is now sandboxed, so you'd need a sandbox escape. But they got not a single entrant. So in aggregate, under favorable conditions, reliable remote exploits can still be developed, but the amount of time to develop them has gone from, days to weeks or possibly months. And under non-favorable conditions, such as, a constrained environment when you're attacking particular server software, the cost for bypassing mitigations is very high and sometimes not even possible. I would say the cost of a chain takes about 10 to 14 weeks, but that's, like I said, assuming you can't reuse some of your techniques, which sometimes you can. There's limited data I found also to find the fact that criminals are struggling to keep up with these mitigations as well. The most interesting was from Matt Miller and Dave Weston, who showed that even though the amount of remote bugs being found in Microsoft products is going up over time, the amount of vulnerabilities they're finding exploited in the wild in their software is on a strict downward trajectory, and that's ever since about Windows 8. So that's a sign, I think, that some of the things are working. Qualys also noticed that in the wild, Flash exploitation has halved in the last year or so. And that makes sense because Flash has been putting in a lot of mitigations and doing a lot more aggressive patching recently as well. So I wanted to talk about what I think is the future for exploitation of these bugs and mitigations, but I only have about a minute left, so I'm going to try and go as quick as I can. I think exploitable memory corruption bugs occurring within ubiquitous software is going to become increasingly rare. I think exploitable bugs will be the exception rather than the rule. And this is because a lot of software is being rewritten in more type-safe languages. Case in point is a number of JavaScript engines being written largely in, a fair bit of it is being rewritten in JavaScript itself. The IDE tools are getting very sophisticated, and these companies like Google and Microsoft have so much money to throw at fuzzing and triaging that they're going to be able to mow down a lot of the bugs before they become a real problem. I think we're on the precipice of a new iteration of mitigations that are going to be very interesting for memory corruption. They're at the moment severely tending towards the later exploitation stages, where we basically have only verified code that has been cryptographically hashed and verified to be running on devices. And this is the area we're going in. It's a strategy that was popularized by Apple with iOS, originally with their user mode code signing, and now with their kernel patch protection. Microsoft has had this kind of technology for a long time, but they've not really deployed it en masse in the same way that iOS has. However, that's about to change with the creators preview. They've got credential guard and application guard, and basically the idea is to only allow verified code to be loaded and running and prevent executable code from being mapped in the first place. So I think in light of this kind of stuff, also JIT hardening is going to be a thing. So JIT hardening has already, there's already been some mitigations put in place, but they're kind of terrible at the moment. In the future, I think that stuff like out-of-process JIT, which is what Edge is doing, is going to be an enormous problem when it's coupled with NX and so forth. So I think it's likely that the next-gen memory exploits are going to be largely data-only attacks, which is essentially what's already happening for kernel mode exploits. Instead of getting code execution in the kernel, often people just modify their token or whatever. And I think that it's likely that other, other types of memory corruption attacks will follow suit. Integrity of data structures, I also think, is going to be an area of increasing interest. So with heap mitigations, they're very concerned with making sure the integrity of the heap is okay, but there's been not that much work to check the integrity of various other data structures. And this also is starting to change with both Microsoft and Apple, particularly in kernel, checking the various kernel data structures have not been modified in memory. And in fact, Microsoft just announced with their ATP Defender thing that that it will continually, it scans kernel memory for things like when you've turned SMEP off or something like that. Mitigations are becoming increasingly hardware-based. I'm basically getting shoved off the stage by the timer, so I might just skip the hardware-based things. So you can go back and look at my slides if you're interested, but suffice to say, I think that CPU-level bugs, with the increased complexity of rolling in protections into the CPU, might be targeted and exploited. And we've started seeing this in real applications recently with like Rowhammer that Mark Seaborn and Halvar Flake did, and also with the recent ANC ASLR bypass that was able to be triggered from JavaScript. And lastly, I think that isolation technologies are currently underutilized. I talked about how much sandboxes add to the cost of exploit development, but the next iteration of this is going to be using hypervisors and secure memory areas, secure processes such as Apple's SEP in a more ubiquitous fashion. And and Microsoft with Creators Preview is, like I said, introducing Application Guard and Credential Guard, which basically runs Edge in a hypervisor, it runs LSA in a hypervisor, and so getting to the rest of the system is going to require possibly like a kernel exploit and then a hypervisor escape, which will again dramatically increase the cost of developing an exploit chain. I think that full chains will be still possible, but extremely high cost compared to what they are now, and it will most likely be unattainable for organizations to have all of those vulnerabilities worked up and working at the same, for the same period of time. And as a result, for lengthy periods of time, they'll only be able to do partial compromises. I think it'll take about a year's worth of work to create such a chain. So in summary, some people will go to the lengths to develop these chains, but I think attackers are pragmatic and will basically go for easier wins. Stuff like IoT devices, which at the moment, for the most part, way less protected than your Windows 10 machine or your iPhone. And when you do attack high security devices, I think they'll yield limited compromise. Maybe they won't be able to break the hypervisor, but they'll get to kernel and they'll be able to do some useful things. Maybe they'll get access to some data or be able to modify some security settings. So that's all I've got for now. So thanks for listening, everyone.